Hello, in this video we'll be looking at issue 11 of Warhammer 40,000 Imperium magazine. Our librarian in Phobos Armour we get with this issue, and learning how to use his psychic abilities on the battlefield. Hello, I'm Mike, and this as well. We are the Tabletop Donkeys.
Hello.
I'm bringing you issue 11 of Warhammer 40,000 Imperium today. In this issue, we got a librarian in Phobos Armour for the Space Marines, and a medium dry brush. And as always, if you just want to skip straight to the battle report for this issue, there'll be a time code in the description, or you can use the chapter bars. But I'm going to quick look through the issue first. First up, we have the battle record and background on the librarian. In Phobos Armour, the stealthy psychic warrior. And so you can see some of his equipment, like his force sword. So it's a special sword designed for use by psychers that allow them to channel their psychic energy through them. He wears a camo cloak to keep him hidden, and he has a psychic hood which helps regulate his psychic powers and also protect them from attacks by enemy psychers. And we only have his battle record on the next page. We can give him a name and a title and also a rank, which we'll learn about in a little bit, and also a preview of some of the psychic powers he'll be able to use in later games, no doubt. And then some background on the librarius itself. So these are the psychers of the Space Marine chapters. We've learned about psychers before. So they're also responsible for maintaining things like the chapter's history and bank of knowledge, and also ever watchful for the presence of chaos corruption in the ranks of their chapters as well. And over on the next page we have the ranks of the librarius. So each chapter will have a chief librarian, and then there will be ones below him. Each have slightly different roles, but most of them are expected to fight on the battlefield. Different librarians might be trained in different psychic disciplines, so different powers they can use. Now we have some background on the war gear of the Necrons. So each Necron lord within a dynasty will often have their own household army full of powerful vehicles and weapons. And on the next page we have some of the melee weapons available. So we've seen the hyperphase blades that the destroyers have. I also mentioned some of these here, like the war scythe and the staff of light, some of which the other nobles will choose to use. Now we have the build guide for the librarian. So he is not an easy to build model, so you will need glue to put him together. He's not too difficult to put together. Once his body's together, it's mostly about just sticking bits on. It's fairly simple. And try and make sure he goes centrally on the base so he doesn't look a bit weird. Then the painting guide. Unlike the other Marines, you're going to be base coating him black rather than blue, mainly to get the shadow under the cloak. So after the black, you want to go over the blue, like the other Marines. Librarians are usually depicted wearing blue armour, regardless of what chapter they have, but he's an Ultramarines one, so it makes sense for him to wear blue. Then we have in grey for the camo cloak, which covers most of him. And then going for Corax White over the rocks on his base, and then over some of the pipes and his face. You might actually want to do his face first with the Corax White, to see if you do make any mistakes, it'll be covered up by the grey and the blue. And then going over some of the gold, so there's lots of little skulls with horns, the hilt of his sword, little bits on his book and his keys as well. And then going over silver for things like buckles and his sword blade, his keyring as well. So we're not actually using the dry brush in this issue, but obviously we'll be using that in later painting guides. With that over, we can get into our game for this issue.
So now we can be on to our game for this issue, and the Space Marine Librarian in Phobos Armour has entered the Necron complex to try and assist his brothers, but even though he's moving stealthily, he ends up being ambushed by Necron Scarab constructs, which are trying to repair the damage and destroy invaders to their home. So we set up the larger board. Up at point A, we've got the unit of 3 Canoptek Scarabs, swarms. Royal Warden starts down the bottom at point B, and the Librarian starts at the sort of top middle on point C. And one Scarab model has to be set up on point A, and then the others have to be placed in coherency and wholly within 5 inches of the mat edge. Now on the next page we have the rules for the Librarian. So he has a 6-inch move, he only has a weapon skill of ballistics at a 3+, I guess because he focuses more on his psychic abilities than combat excellence. Strength and toughness 4 with 5 wounds and 4 attacks and a 3+ save. He has a bolt pistol, so unlike the heavy bolt pistols that doesn't have any AP and it's only got a 12-inch range. And a force sword, which is strength user +1 with -3 AP, but it does D3 damage. And he has a special rule, he is a psyker, so he can manifest a psychic power in the psychic phase, which we'll talk about in a second, and he knows the smite psychic power. So we've got an explanation of that here. Psyker just means he can manifest psychic powers in the psychic phase, which he doesn't state explicitly, but that actually comes after the movement phase and before the shooting phase. So if you have a psyker in your army, that's when they do psychic things. And the smite psychic power requires a psychic test of 5+. That will be explained in the playthrough in a second. If it is successfully manifested, the closest visible enemy unit within 18 inches suffers D3 mortal wounds. Again, we'll learn about what that means in a moment. And then we've got the data sheets for the Royal Warden and the Canoptek Scarabs. The Royal Warden is exactly the same as he was a couple of issues ago. Canoptek Scarabs have a 10-inch move. They can also fly, as you can see in their abilities, which there's a tutorial for at the bottom of this page. They have a 4+ weapon skill. They don't have a ballistic skill because they don't have any shooting attacks. Their strength and toughness 3. They have 4 wounds per swarm, but that's per base, and 4 attacks. They only have a 6+ save though. And their melee weapon is their feeder mandibles, which is a standard close combat weapon, no AP and 1 damage, but every time an attack is made with the weapon, if you roll a 6 to hit, unmodified, it automatically wounds, so you don't need to roll to wound for that attack. And they also have living metal, so if a Scarab Swarm is wounded, then it regains a wound at the start of each turn. So here we learn about mortal wounds. A mortal wound automatically inflicts a point of damage on the target unit. You don't need to roll to wound, and you can't take any saving throws, even invulnerable saves against them. They're also always allocated one at a time, so even if you have multiple, they can spill over to other models. There's also a table here to how to roll a d3 for that and for the Librarian's force sword damage. And then how to fly. So models that can fly can move over other models when they make a normal move, advance, fallback or charge. They can ignore vertical distances when they do so, so you can move them up to a higher level of something without taking that into account. And they can move within engagement range of enemy models as long as they don't end their move within engagement range, to represent the fact they can just fly over them. Here we have the Space Marine turn walkthrough, and here it does actually explain how psychic powers work, so we'll just quickly go over that. When attempting to manifest a psychic power, you have to take a psychic test. To do this, you roll 2 dice and compare it to the warp charge value of the psychic power that you're trying to cast. So as we saw for Smite, that is 5. So if you roll 5 or more, the psychic test is a success and it works, and if not, then it fails. For Smite, as we've seen, that does D3 mortal wounds to the closest visible enemy unit. And there's an example of how that works down here, just so you can see it visually. But after his psychic powers, the Librarian gets to shoot and charge and fight as normal. There's also a description here of how the Scarabs' automatic wounds work with their feeder mandibles, and that comes into effect. That's 6 that they roll automatic wounds. But then everything is as we're familiar with. The Necrons get their turn after that. And the victory conditions are just if one side is wiped out, the other side wins, and there's no turn limit to accomplish that. So we'll set up the board on the models, and then we'll get straight into the game, and we can see how all those new rules work. So here we set up the board. We've got the Royal Warden down the bottom left there, the Scarabs up at the top left, and the Librarian in the middle of the board at the top. The Librarian gets to go first, so we'll be on to the Space Marine's first turn.
And the Librarian's just going to move 6 inches towards the Scarabs. Then in the Psychic phase, he'll try and manifest Smite, needing a 5, getting a 7, so that is successfully manifested. He'll do D3 mortal wounds to the Scarabs for 3.
So they just take 3 wounds with no saves allowed. Scarab bases have 4 wounds, so we'll just take this one here down to 1 remaining.
Then it's the shooting phase, where the Librarian will fire his bolt pistol at the Scarabs. Single shot hitting on a 3. It does. Wounds on a 3, because they're only toughness 3. It does.
It doesn't have any AP, and they have a 6+ save, which they failed, so that's a wound. So that destroys the wounded Scarab base.
Then we're on to the charge phase, where the Librarian will charge the Scarabs. And an 8 is easily enough. The Librarian's just going to move into contact with both of them like that.
And he gets to strike because he charged.
So we have 4 attacks on the Librarian, hitting on 3s, getting 3 hits. Wounding on 3s, getting 3 wounds. So it's -3 AP, so there'll be no saves. Each one does D3 damage.
Yes, now these are to be rolled one at a time because it does specify in the playthrough, although not very clearly, that if a multi-wound model takes more wounds than it has, the excess wounds don't spill over onto another model, so we do need to roll these one at a time. Well, actually, you could roll the first 2 because if you want.
Yeah, I suppose I'll roll the first 2 because 1 alone isn't enough to kill a Scarab Swarm. So there's 4 wounds from the first 2 D3.
Yeah, for 4 damage.
And that will kill a base, and then the other Scarab base will take another wound.
So I'll take away this Scarab base, it takes 4 damage from those 2 hits, and then this one will suffer the 3rd hit and go down to 3 wounds. But then it gets to fight back, it doesn't need to pile in. It has 4 attacks hitting on 4s, but 6s automatically wound. So they've got 2 normal hits, and that's 6 automatically wounds, so I'll put that aside for a moment. Then these normal ones get to wound. They win on 5s though, because it's only strength 3 and he's toughness 4. So 1 further wound, so combined with the automatic one, that's 2 going through.
2 3+ saves. Failed 1, so the Librarian stands up 4 wounds.
He takes a wound. That's the end of the Librarian's first turn, on to Necron turn 1. So at the start of the turn, that Scarab base, thanks to living metal, regains a wound and goes back up to 4, so just take the dice away. And then in the movement phase, the Scarab base will fall back. It can fly over the Librarian. It hasn't got its full 10 inches, the reason being I want it to be the closest target when the Librarian gets to use Smite next turn, so if it goes there, there's no way he can make the Royal Warden the closest target. But the Royal Warden himself has just moved across and he is within 15 inches to shoot twice at the Librarian, so he's going to do that. So 4 shots with his rapid fire weapon, hitting on 3s. No, 1 hit. Strength 5, so it wins on a 3. It did. It has -2 AP.
5+ save. Failed.
And it does 2 damage.
Yeah, Librarian's down to 2 wounds.
But that's the end of my turn. On to Librarian's turn 2.
So I moved him up normally. Technically, you can still use psychic powers after you advance, but it might be better to try and charge, even though it is a long charge.
But then we're on to the psychic phase.
Yeah, I'm going to try and use Smite again. Needing a 5, getting an 8. It will hit the Scarabs for D3. That's 2 mortal wounds.
So the Scarab base is down to 2 remaining.
And then, before his bolt pistol, the Scarabs fall. One shot hitting on a 3, he missed. And in the charge phase, we'll try and charge the Royal Warden. Looks like a 9. And we actually get an 8. Oof. So that's a failed charge.
And it's the end of the Space Marine turn as well, so on to the Necron turn. At the start of my turn, the Scarab Swarm regains a wound, going back up to 3. The Royal Warden has just moved over. He's still within 15 inches of the Librarian. Obviously, he's much better at shooting him than in combat, so I'm trying to stay away. And the Scarab Swarm has moved to just be in the way again, and be closer for Smite once again if the Librarian survives. Then on to the shooting phase, where the Royal Warden will shoot. 4 shots hitting on 3s. Oh, I actually got 3 hits this time. Wounding on 3s, getting 2 wounds.
5+ saves. Failed both.
Yeah, only had 2 wounds left, and it's a 2 damage weapon, so he dies. So obviously that's a Necron victory in the first game. We'll do a best of 3 as usual, so we'll set up and go again. We've set up again. I set the Scarabs up in a line this time rather than the way they were before, but otherwise it's the same, so the Librarian can get on with his first turn.
Yeah, so we're just going to move up 6 inches. Try and manifest Smite in the psychic phase. Needing a 5, getting a 6. Stingy 3 mortal wounds to the Scarabs, just 1 this time.
I'll put it on that one in the corner.
Then the Librarian will fire his bolt pistol at them. Single shot hitting on a 3. He missed. In the charge phase, he'll try and charge them. But a 3 is not going to be enough.
No, definitely not. That's definitely more than 3 inches. So that's the end of his turn. On to the Necron turn. At the start of the turn, that Scarab regains the wound it lost from the Smite, and then they'll move to block off the Librarian, essentially. And the Royal Warden move to get himself within 15 inches, and then he will shoot. 4 shots hitting on 3s. Getting all 4. Wounding on 3s. 2 wounds, so you can't kill it with this.
2 5+ saves. Failed both. It's down to 1 wound.
Then in the charge phase, the Scarabs will declare a charge, so you can finish him off. They got a 6. They'll just move in like that, just to be in the way of the Librarian, and then they get to attack because they charged. So 4 attacks each makes 12, hitting on 4s. 6 is automatically wounds, so 2 automatic wounds, but otherwise only 2 hits. The normal hits wound on 5s, and 1 more, so 3 saves for the Librarian.
Need to make all of these, 3+. He failed one, so he's killed. So the Librarian goes down.
And that is another victory for the Necrons. So yeah, definitely a favourable scenario for the Necrons this one. We won't try again and let the Necrons go first, because that's probably just going to be even worse. So we'll call that a Necron victory for this issue and recap those games for you now. So that was the game for issue 11 of Warhammer 40,000 Imperium magazine. How do you think that went?
Not too far from what I expected, to be honest. The Librarian has to do an awful lot of damage and doesn't really have that many wounds when he's being shot at with a weapon that does 2 damage. So I think the second game probably went worse than it should have, but it's not too surprising that he gets shot a bit by the Royal Warden. I think and his lack of an invulnerable save is his major weakness, I think. If the Librarian can get into melee with the Royal Warden, then he's probably okay, because then the Royal Warden will never be able to shoot again. But he has to do 12 wounds to the Scarab, and I think he could do a maximum of 16, so it's technically possible, but it's probably fairly unlikely to kill off all of the Scarabs. And his Force Sword is actually a fairly powerful weapon, because he can do 3 damage, but you can tell that he's just not as durable or as good in melee as the Lieutenant or the Captain, which I suppose is, to be fair, he has more of a support role. No doubt we'll learn about other psychic powers other than Smite that can improve your other units on the battlefield, which is probably why you would take the Librarian. Although Smite is quite handy to have, can do quite a lot of damage. As I said, you are allowed to use psychic powers even if you advance, which can be quite handy.
I think all Psychers basically have Smite by default, and then they have other powers on top of this.
And it is handy to do mortal wounds, particularly against tough targets, because you can't make saves against mortal wounds. It's pretty handy to have.
And obviously, I suppose the reason they include him in this issue is so they can teach us about the psychic phase, which, going forward, Necrons don't have Psychers, so won't ever have one to oppose him with. Although I think the Necrons do get some options for trying to stop psychic powers anyway, but whether we actually get those in this magazine, we don't know yet.
Yeah, and some factions like the Necrons don't have any Psykers at all, while there are other factions that are very Psyker heavy, where basically all of their units will be Psykers. Whereas the Space Marines, I guess, are a fairly middling Psyker faction. I think the Librarian is the only one we get, so it's not going to be a very Psyker heavy army. Also worth noting that the Librarian in Phobos Armour is an important distinction, because a regular Librarian will actually get slightly different psychic powers. I'm not sure how they'll do with that in the magazine. I assume we'll get the Phobos Librarian ones, and I think there are some slightly different rules. And I suppose we should talk about Scarabs as well. They're a really handy utility unit for the Necrons because they're really fast and they can fly. They're really handy to nip off and nab objectives, especially once we start using terrain. And they're a really good speed bump as well because 4 wounds is actually quite a lot to get through.
And they regain a wound at the start of the turn as well, so even if you do damage them, you have to actually finish them off, otherwise they keep coming back.
And they're fairly cheap to field, I think, as well.
Yeah. They're handy for flying off in advance and charging into like a firepower support unit or something as well that isn't perhaps so good in melee, because then they can just bog them down and hold them up. Then they have to either fall back and not shoot or slog it out in melee. They don't do a huge amount of damage in melee, but if you roll well, then those 6s that automatically wound can be handy, because otherwise they're not going to do that many wounds, especially against toughness 4 things like Space Marines.
Yeah, you're more better off using them as screening units.
And I sort of tried to do that in this game by just keeping him close to the Librarian, because I don't really care if you smite the Scarabs, they're not that important.
Yeah, and they're a large base as well. Makes it annoying to get around them.
And the way they come on the sprue means you always get 3 when you buy some warriors, so if you're getting a Necron army, you're probably going to want a fair few warriors, so you end up with plenty of Scarabs anyway. And they're very easy to put together because they're just one piece that goes on the rock on the base, basically. As I said in the previous issue, you might want to leave them off the base to paint them, because it's much easier to paint the base if the Scarabs are not glued to it, because it's difficult to get the brush underneath the Scarabs.
I suppose it is worth pointing out that this issue is very good value for money if you want a Librarian in Phobos Armour. I really like the Librarian in Phobos Armour model. I really like the pose and the cloak. It certainly makes him stand out compared to the rest of the base Marines we've had so far, ironically, given he's meant to be all sneaky, but...
And he looks completely different to the regular Primaris Librarian model, which we don't get with this collection, but we did get with Conquest. Yeah. So putting them alongside each other, it's a completely different aesthetic. The other one's more of a sort of warrior mystic with all the robes and everything, whereas this one is very clearly a sneaky type, I suppose.
And I suppose also worth pointing out that I painted in blue, even though I play Silver Templars are normally silver, and that's because Librarians, I think they're nearly always depicted as wearing blue armour, regardless of what chapter they're in. I think it's just to make them stand out, because I think we saw in the chapter organisation, Librarians they're not part of the rank and file, they're a part of the command detachment.
And we have learned about the Codex Astartes, I think, at least it's been mentioned in the lore sections, and I think it just says that Librarians are supposed to be blue. Not all chapters adhere to that, so you don't have to paint your Librarian blue, especially if it would clash. If you're not painting them as Ultramarines or blue would clash with your colour scheme, then feel free to do whatever you want. You can paint them how you wish. Yeah. Anyway, that'll be it for this video, so if you enjoyed this content, then please leave a like and subscribe. Let us know your thoughts on the games, on Librarians, and what you're planning to do with them or whatever. We've been the Tabletop Donkeys, and we'll see you in the next one.
Bye for now.